we're going to continue into this topic tomorrow. It goes quite nicely with the IPO topic. I never really expected I would get through everything in one day, but I always give it a go. And so what I want to do here is get started, for example. Come on, wait, now there's no reason for it not to work. I fixed that other thing. There we go. Very fancy slide. I am going to use a bit of a journey metaphor through this whole course, because the way I see it, the best way to learn about M&A is to think about the different kinds of transactions which naturally fit in the life cycle of a company. And we've been talking about all these big transactions, these different options, but as we think about the life cycle of a company, or the lifestyle for that matter, I think we can get a sense of how these transactions fit in with what it is that companies do, and this idea of ultimately funding something. Because M&A transactions at the end of the day are about funding something, whether it's about funding a shareholder's exit, turning our business into cash that they can put into the bank and retire on, or whether it is about funding the future development of the business itself. So going on this journey, often how businesses start is they start with an idea. They start with something that somebody is going to do. So my metaphor for the idea is because I really like robots. And so say you built a robot. You had a shop front there for you at home, a shop front, and you built robots. Do you need a company to build robots? No. Especially if it's just you. Is there anybody else in this room who's interested in robots? Am I the only one? Oh, that will be very helpful. Good to know. I will draw upon you again. Very large one. Okay. Well, as an independent shopfront, I've started with an idea and I've basically brought it to reality, and I can do that as a sole trader. Are there any of you who actually have your own businesses that you work as sole traders? Or you're not a sole trader. Are you a sole trader? Yeah. So, and that's consulting business? Conveyancing. Oh, of course. So you work as a sole trader. You haven't incorporated? No, my law firm, I haven't incorporated either. I just don't own anything. It's just like, that's how it works. I don't own anything either. So sole practice as a conveyancer, I have a law firm, and now my robot manufacturing business as well. I actually have a consulting business that sits aside because of the legal rules. I have to separate out my accounts and do all of that. But at the end of the day, this is just me doing a business. So if I borrow money to fund my robot business, I borrow the money. The robot business goes belly up. I still have to pay the debts, right? So ultimately, we've got more and more businesses that are starting this way. Lots of people globally are running little small businesses. The number of ABNs, so everybody know what an ABN is, an Australian business number. The number is growing every year. Actually, do you have any insight on what the numbers are? That's a terrible question to ask without notice, but do you have any sort of sense of how many ABNs the tax department issues every year?
I'm not in that area. I could
No?
find out for you.
I think it's pretty public record. I just didn't think to find out beforehand. It's just, to me, it's quite interesting to look, an interesting stat to look at, to think about how the market is going, is how many they issue and how many get cancelled. So, and you know, when the issues are growing and the cancellations are falling, usually means people are doing okay, right? But as I'm running my little robot business, I won't inquire into your conveyancing business, and I won't even mention my little law firm that I keep forgetting to do business in. It may turn out that in order to continue to develop my product, that I need funding. I need additional funding to do things. So there are things that I can do. I can borrow money. So this guy here, he's got investments in robot companies. He might lend me some money. I could enter into, it doesn't need to be an equity transaction, right? I could just borrow money and then I would have to pay it back. Let's say he lends me, I'm going to pay it back almost immediately. In fact, let me just give you some money for the transaction. What have I done with my bag of goodies here?
Yeah.
Oh, here? Yep. I'll seed you. That's too much. Oh, it's all too much. Here. I'll give you 500 million. There you go. Good, clean Zimbabwean ancient currency. That is real Zimbabwean money that I have here, because I just got sick of playing with monopoly money and I thought we needed some big dollars in it. I felt like you guys were deserving of the big transactions. So yeah, we have, I've got billions here, basically billions and billions of Zimbabwe currency to deal with this. I also have $1, so I can deal with that separately. So just say you lend me that money. Can you lend me that money, please?
What security are you getting?
Well, we're not going to get that complex at the moment. But I'll tell you what, you can have my house because of how this transaction is going to. I will actually give you a mortgage, a second, third, fourth mortgage over my house as security for your somewhat substantial loan, as it turns out, for me to fund my robot company. So I'm going to take this money and I am going to spend it wisely on growing my robot business. And I'm actually quite successful. So as a consequence, I'm going to actually pay him the loan back with some interest. Okay, here we go. My business is now worth quite a lot more than it was before. Let's say it's doubled in value. That I am producing these incredibly expensive, somewhat clunky, but expensive robots at the rate of 2 a month, and I'm selling them for at a profit margin of about 50% because I don't have many competitors. Not so many people building this particularly type of very useful robot. So does he get any interest in my company? Can he go around saying, oh, I invested in this robot company and I've now made a lot of money? I'm getting a lot of the shaking heads. Of course not. Because effectively, I took the risk that if I couldn't pay it back, if my company didn't grow, I would need to basically, he would get rights to a security. I pay him back with the interest. That is the consideration. So the promise to pay interest is the consideration for the promise to lend me money, and he doesn't have any equity in it. What if I were to say, hey, look, I've got this really good, so we're at the same point, we've grown a little bit, I'm making 2 of these a month, I'm making a margin of about 50%. Let us sort of value it on the basis, really to grow to the next stage, I need another, I've realised that these are ridiculously big numbers now, and I can't even just look at that many zeros and work out whether it's billions or trillions or anything because I am not that smart and my eyesight isn't that good. But just say we need a bit of extra money here. And I say, okay, I want to go to the market now. All of you take some money if you like. You might decide to just take some and we'll all play this game together. Pass it down, take a note or two so you can work out how you're going to invest your money as you go. I am now going to the market. I am saying, okay, I need to get some investment. So this is a type of, it's not technically an M&A transaction as such, but it's a corporate transaction, the type of transaction that M&A lawyers do all the time, if you get a lawyer involved at all, right? So I'm looking for investors in my business. Now, chances are I'm going to start with what we in the trade call 3 Fs. And mean anything to any of you? Friends, family. Sometimes we say fools, sometimes we say something that ends with wits. But anyway, basically these are people that are close to us. I just saw somebody reject money. I've actually just realised that I am recording where I am giving large number value notes to students in my class, I'm thinking I'd probably just breached a few ethical rules. I am expecting you to invest them back at some point. So, okay, so we'll just use proximity here because it's going to be easier. I've got my brother, I've got my uncle, I've got my best mate, I've got, oh, you can be the fool. Here we are, I've got a guy, my best mate's mate. And I said, look, I'm doing really well here. I want to build the business. I need to take, I need some investment. Do you want to come in? Do you want to partner with me? Is that the kind of language you can imagine somebody using? Do you want to partner with me? Okay, so how could we do that? What kind of transaction could we use?
You could use, well, if you wanted to be from an investor perspective, you could use convertible debt.
So let's not structure it yet. Let's just go, we're just going to keep it pretty high level to think about what kinds of transactions that we could use. So one of them is we could literally form a partnership, couldn't we? We could agree, we're just close, few mates here, family members, mates, my mate's mate, we could agree to go into a partnership. Okay, so then if I then decide, and the partnership might work like this quite easily. We'll put in, my partners might be just financial partners, often called silent partners. You guys might pop it in the middle there, pop in some cash. I know it's a little bit silly, but I think it's worth actually just sort of playing the game a little bit here. And I'm going to pop in my intellectual property and my time. Sorry. I think, yeah, there's another power plug right underneath, if that helps you. So I'll agree to spend time, I'll agree to give you my intellectual property, and we'll grow the business. Now, we might have agreed, we would probably negotiate what our shares were worth. Maybe, how many did I end up with? 5 of us all up, me and the rest of you. You put some money in, you put in different amounts of money, we would work out a calculation. So we started running out of money. We go to borrow some money from somebody else. Does the partnership borrow money? How does that work? We would be jointly and severally liable. So I might be the only person working in the business, and I go up there to Carly and I say, Dude, I really need you to help me with my tax, for the business tax. I need the partnership taxes done. Can you help me with that? I've just forgotten that she works for government now, and that's probably a breach, but we'll just pretend that you just you've got your own little sole practice there and you're prepared to do our taxes, and I agree to pay, I reckon if you did our taxes, this $100 billion or $10 billion is probably, Zimbabwe dollars is absolutely what it's worth. $10 trillion, sorry, $10 trillion for you. I might commit to spending that amount of money. But actually, because I'm not very good with cash, I suddenly see a shiny coffee mug that I think I would prefer to spend that 10 trillion on. I do that. And it turns out that that pile of money that we have in the centre here, the investment that my partners have made, has all been eaten up on shiny coffee cups and additional robot parts, and we can't pay the amount of money that we owe Carly. So what happens? You guys are too good. You're wanting to jump the transactions. I actually really want to go really basic here. Ultimately, we've got a partnership. A partnership is not an entity. It is not a legal entity. Each of the partners is jointly and severally liable for the debts of the other partners. So, my friends, family, and the fools, Carly's decided, if she does decide to sue for the balance, $10 trillion is probably worth bringing a lawsuit for. Each of you are at risk for that debt as well. So that seems like a pretty silly way for you to invest in this company where you're just letting me run the show, right? But that, until we had companies, was the way people did business, right? And it is the way, until relatively recently, one of the reasons we use the term firm is because a firm is a term that is used for any entity or group of entities that run a business, including a partnership. So a partnership, by definition, is two or more people doing business in common with a view to making a profit. You don't have to make a profit, you just have to intend to make a profit, and presumably you gave me your hard-earned Zimbabwe dollars here because you intended ultimately to be profitable. So we can create a company. As I said, we often start with as an alternative. So if instead of creating a partnership, my friends here invested their hard-earned instead, and I put in my intellectual property, which we agreed had a value of some sort, we created a company. If it is just closely held, we are fine. But if I was offering it, well, we're under 20 here, but I am looking for large amounts of money, we will have a regulated transaction if we go much further than that. So let me bring that back. I've just realised I'm not actually saying the words to fill the gaps that in these sentences. The starting point is that the Corporations Act says you can't issue shares to people unless you have a prospectus. Well, you cannot issue shares to people without a prospectus unless one of the exceptions applies. So the relevant provision is Section 708 and 709 of the Corporations Act. But where we often start is with privately held companies. So a proprietary limited company is a small company that, and it's small in the sense that it has a maximum number of non-employee shareholders, and it only needs to have one director. But ultimately, that creates a separate legal entity. And that separate legal entity, if we imagine that this envelope is the physical manifestation of a company, because a company is not a physical thing, right? Usually I have a box, but for some reason I forgot to bring my box. The company, everything that we can, the company itself, we can put all of the assets, the cash, the intellectual property into this envelope. All of us own this company. Our shares literally represent our investment in this company. With you guys, somebody has invested $500 million. Somebody has invested a robot. How do we work out what that is? Again, that can create tax issues for us. But usually the way that would work is I would form my company at the very beginning. I would transfer the assets into it, possibly for $1. Possibly I would need to do it for whatever it is that they were worth if it had some value at that early stage. And then that company would then issue new shares at the prices that the investors came in. So it might be that I get 200 shares for $1 plus the value of this asset. Then subsequently, you guys put in some money. So what have I put in? I put in 200 shares for, let's call it $1. So $200, $201 shares. Then the company has bought some assets from me, and we're going to call that $10,000. So the company now has assets that are $10,200. $10,000 worth of the assets that I've transferred in, $200 worth of my hard-earned, the original cash that went into the business. Let's just make it easy. Each of you decide to invest, I need $30,000 to go to the next stage. Each of you decide to invest $30,000. I've now got a company that's worth $20,000. If each of you add $30,000, I'm now already a minority shareholder. I've got what did I say? Oh, I made it less than that, didn't I? I really need to do this with a pen. Let's call it $20,000. Let's make it really easy for me. Let's call it $19,800 plus $200 cash is where the company starts. Each of you add $30,000, so I've got another $60,000. My company is suddenly worth $80,000. I own 20%, $20,000 worth of it, and each of you own $30,000 worth. The number of shares might not represent that. So I've got 200 shares for my $20,000 company. So that roughly means that each of my shares, 201 shares that I paid $1 for, is worth $1,000 each. Each of you would get 300 shares for your $30,000 based on that valuation. You see, pre-money and post-money is the value that we're talking about. So I've identified a need for funding. I've taken funding from strangers, or from friends, families, and fools is what we're going to call them the first time around. We have a company. It has some assets. It now has some cash. It's going to spend that cash probably very quickly on developing intellectual property and developing the things that we're going to do. 6 months down the track, it now has some intellectual property. Competitors come around. This intellectual property now is worth about $10,000, half of what it was when before you guys put the money in. There is now no longer any cash in the bank. Company's gone to Carly and asked us to do tax returns for us. We can't pay. We haven't got enough cash to pay anyway. We've got some assets though.
When I come in and offer to buy shares, $500 each.
At $500 each. So all of the shares in the company.
Well, one day
I need to run a running balance sheet in order to make sense of the numbers that I've made. But yeah, I mean, yeah, we've got a couple of different options here. Firstly, let's talk about liability. Do these lovely gentlemen who took on the risk of investing in my company, they've already lost $30,000 each. It is highly unlikely in the short term that they will be able to get that money back. If Carly sues us for the tax bill that we haven't paid, are these gentlemen liable? Do they have to make a contribution to that? No, and that's the whole concept of incorporation, right? Absolutely. And I know I'm not telling you stuff that you don't know, but I want to work through the factors so you can see how the money moves around. I realise I've started to make different points from the points that I'm going to make on my slides, so we'll get back to that. The next question that comes up is, actually, can Michael rescue us? So there are a couple of different things that could happen at this point. Either we could issue new shares at a price that might be higher or lower than the price that you guys paid, get more money into the company, pay our bills, or you might sell your shares. That's another option. Both of these are the kind of transactions that M&A lawyers do. So if we're continuing to fund the business, if you still think it's a great idea, we just need a little bit more money to keep going, we could agree to take Michael's money into the company. He could throw his money down this end of the table. We could issue him with a new set of shares. Suddenly, we have got...
Well, I'm not buying houses. That's the 500.
He's put 500 of his hard-earned into the company. Now we have I've got 200 shares. He's got 300 shares. He's got 300 shares. He's got 300 shares. And maybe based on the kind of valuations that we were talking about, so that adds up to what? 2, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11. We've got 1,100 shares on offer. We might have given him 900 shares for that. So he's the single largest shareholder. He still doesn't have the majority. Does that mean, so can you see how that the share numbers don't change, but the proportional interests do change. Company now has this money. It spends some of it on paying Carly's bill, and it continues to grow. Does really well after this stage. It may well be that it sells some things, sells some more robots, it reduces its costs, does a whole lot of things that it needs to do, and suddenly it's got all of this extra money in the bank. What does that mean? Does that mean that because Michael put in that 500 at that stage, that he has suddenly, does he have more rights to that additional money than my 3 original investors? No. Proportionality. The number of shares I hold has stayed the same, but the value of them goes up and down depending on what the state of the market is. At the moment, I'm valuing shares based entirely on what's inside my company. The company at the moment is literally this space here. 1 employee, some intellectual property, and some cash. The cash moves in and out every day. We tend to talk about M&A transactions in terms of market value because there is an independent market for those shares. So when you've got a large volume of shares trading on a stock exchange every day, for the most part you can say this is what that company is worth, because this is what people in the market are paying for the shares in the company. But particularly with a private company, what a company is worth is actually what's inside the company. What the shareholders have paid most recently may or may not reflect the value at all. These guys put $30,000 each in for, roughly 30% each, I think is where it sort of ended up, sort of around that mark, with me holding the balance. But that went up and down depending on what the value is. So when we're doing this early stage, and I want to focus on early stage transactions for the rest of the day and as we go into tomorrow, part of what we're doing, or what the market is doing, is working out what's the most appropriate source of funding. Is it debt finance? Is it actually funding from your own resources? At what stage do you start to spread the risk? Can you actually borrow from a bank? Why wouldn't I go to a bank when I'm building my robot business? Maybe I did.
Well, that's for guarantees.
They're likely to ask for guarantees. It may well be that my risky, high risk business is not something that I can get bank loans for. Most of the ventures that I've been involved in, we would never get bank finance because we don't have, particularly at the early stage development process point, we don't have the kinds of things that banks, and for that matter most investors, want to see. We don't have revenues. We don't have profitability. So people at the very early stage are investing in the idea. It can be very hard to work out. So it is often friends, families and fools who are making that investment. So when I move from I have my brother, my uncle, my best mate, his mate, when I move from the first friends, families and fools, and I start to talk to strangers about raising money, that really the regulation starts to kick in. Because if you've never met me before, giving me money because I tell you, robots, dude, they're the next best thing, even if you believe that that is the case, and I have a very convincing argument, it will not surprise you to know that the regulators have stepped in to protect you from being swindled and fooled. So where do we go next? As we actually grow from that storefront position, then we need to start to think about structure. So often at that early stage, even when people have just got a good idea, they will be advised to, and whether it's lawyers or whether it's commercial advice, early stage is when you want to put your venture, particularly if your venture is capable of being more than just your services, into some sort of structure that will give you the ability to raise more money, and ultimately to realise that investment in some way that makes sense. So it's about identifying what kind of capital you require. So capital, when we talk about companies, we talk about the capital account. We talk about what is the capital in the business. The capital is literally this: the money and the intellectual property or the other assets. I've said intellectual property here, but they could be physical assets. It could be the stuff that you made. It could be the factory that you built. It could be the processes that you have. To a lesser extent, an asset is, and lesser extent is the wrong word, it's the goodwill that you have built, your repeat customers. So goodwill is literally, from an accounting perspective, it is the difference between the value of the assets that you have and it's basically the balancing item on your balance sheet. It is the difference between the value of the physical value of the assets and the amount or the value that you have in the business itself. So if I can sell my business for $10 million, but what I have is assets that if I sold them separately would be worth $100, and cash that brings me to $1,000, then $999,000 of my asset value is goodwill. It is the difference between the physical assets and what it is that we're about to spend money on. That is usually, traditionally it's been customers, it's been repeat business, but it could be the value of the idea in some way. One of the things that impacts the way we think about structure at this early stage is the regulatory requirements as well. So every time, once I've got my company formed, every time I issue shares, I need to know that I'm not breaking the law. And I have probably set up as a proprietary company. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I've got a cap on the number of non-employee shareholders that I can have. So at this small cap stage, at this beginning stage, what happens? I'm still the only employee. I'm running the show. What happens when these shareholder mates of mine don't agree with the way that I'm running the business? What can they do? So we didn't talk about board positions at all. I didn't offer them one and they didn't ask for it, so I didn't see the need personally. Usually when you hand over, you've only given me $500,000, but usually if you hand over a couple of mil or you're looking to get more than 20% of an interest in a company, you would be looking for a board position commercially. Why would that be? So you don't have any say as a shareholder? I think the short answer is yes, you don't have a great deal of say as a shareholder. And so you would be looking at early on thinking about, well, what if I don't like the direction that she's taking the business? Why is she spending so much money on the tax returns and not enough on R&D? We need to actually get in there as board positions. So even when you've got very small companies with a single employee, it is not at all unusual to find, particularly when strangers' money has come in, that you have got quite a large board or board representing different investors. What other things could you do other than board positions? She's still got to get me to agree to a board position. What other things could you do at the time you were making the investment to deal with the potential for disputes with management as a shareholder? Shareholders Agreement, absolutely. So the shareholders could agree up front. It's quite common in a shareholders agreement to say, okay, we're going to agree a budget and a plan for every 6 months, and you can only do the things that are in the budget and the plan. And if you want to do anything outside that, we have to have a shareholders meeting. Absolutely. The other issue at this early stage too is, my guess is, my friends, my family here in particular, quite often they're only investing to help me out. It is quite common that the very first investors in small business are just really, that's what they're doing. They're being friends, they're being family. It might be a smallish investment, but often they want to get the money back at some stage. So part of the thinking at this really early stage is about, how do we realise this? How do we make sure that my uncle here, who's given me, well, in this case, $500 million, so he's a pretty rich uncle, I guess. But my guess is, Tom, you got a problem that, like, is it a problem for you if I've got 500 million of your hard-earned? You're right with me keeping it for a while, or would you be a little bit anxious about getting it back over time? This can be one of the things that is one of the biggest issues for founder shareholders, is they've got family members who have borrowed against their mortgage, or they have, against their houses, that they've, gone into their retirement savings to fund the business. And that can be a big load on a startup founder, who really, in an ideal world, would be focusing on realising the business, but is ultimately trying to work out how to get Uncle Tom his money back, or to eke it out in some way that makes sense. And ultimately, this is what founders need to be thinking about, is these strategic drivers. How are they actually going to have enough money to do the things that they want to do? So we're going to keep coming back to these strategic driver questions, understanding what they're trying to achieve. But these kind of startup funding transactions are the things that are really, really core to getting this started. They'll be tiny, and then we'll get bigger and bigger as we go. So I think it's time for you guys to do a little bit of thinking and working. So I'm going to run a little quiz. You can attach yourself to the quiz with this code, which I'll have there for a second or two, but I am going to bring up the website in a second. You all look very sleepy now. So if we can get a few people in here, I don't think it has music like Kahoot does, but it pretty much works the same way. Feel free to use a nickname. This helps me get a sense of how people are doing and where I need to concentrate my efforts. So the way that this one works is that there will be more points if you are quick, no points if you get it wrong or you don't answer. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Anybody who's planning to play along, still trying to get in? Okay. Answer fast to get more points. Which of the following is true? Shareholders have a right to receive dividends, vote on company accounts, vote for the members of the company's board, appoint and remove directors. Everyone has voted. Interesting. So let's talk about this, because this is one of the most common places that I see issues with small investors and the companies. If a dividend has been declared, then investors have a right. But investors have absolutely no mechanism to insist that a company declares a dividend. And it is a matter for the board whether or not they declare a dividend or they reinvest profits. So a company can only declare a dividend if it has sufficient profits, or more recently there's some changes to the Corporations Act allow a company to declare a dividend from accrued earnings, provided that it doesn't affect creditors, and it has to go through a number of different steps. But asset-rich companies, even if they haven't been profitable, can declare dividends in some ways. But there is no right. Shareholders cannot make the company release money to it. So me sitting here in our little privately owned company with a ton of cash in the bank and a whole lot of profits, but a desire to continue to build my intellectual property and to invest in research and development, even though my friends and family are saying, Kath, come on, Uncle Tom needs to retire. Your cousin's getting married. They need to spend this money on these other things. Unless they are members of the board, they cannot actually make that happen.
Berkshire Hathaway is a good example.
Berkshire Hathaway is an excellent example. Berkshire Hathaway was originally an unprofitable company where Warren Buffett, when it took it over, couldn't actually make the original. It's a mill, isn't it? A clothing mill or a linen mill of some sort. Couldn't actually make it profitable, so instead just started to use that vehicle to make other investments. Never changed the name. Of course, American companies, it's not necessarily a great thing to compare the way that American companies return value to shareholders with Australian companies, because the taxation rules are different. So American companies in particular will often do share buybacks. So they will return value to shareholders by basically making an offer on market to buy the shares rather than to release profits. And again, I can't remember exactly what the taxation differences are, but they affect both the shareholder and the companies differently under the American rules.
So prospectus will generally have a term in there to say that it will issue dividends at the company's discretion.
When you're issuing a prospectus, it will generally say what the dividend policy is.
Right.
Now, companies that are not profitable, so my company, when we listed, for example, it had not yet made a profit, still hasn't, basically said it's the intention of the directors, when profitable, to pay a dividend, but we cannot guarantee when that will be. Most boards will have a policy, but it will be a policy, and we all know the difference between a policy and a contractual promise, right? So they will say what their intention is, and if they don't actually do what is expected, shareholders can vote by buying and selling shares on market. That's great, but when we're talking about a small 3F company, something that is owned by a small number of people who are not the directors, they have no say in relation to those things unless they have board representation. The other one that is often problematic is, while company shareholders have the right to vote on who a director will be, they don't actually have any rights as such to appoint directors. So the path that goes to appointing a director is any director, not any director, the board can appoint a director. So if we have a sole director company, so a proprietary limited company only needs to have one director, the directors can appoint a new director, and at the next general meeting of the company that happens after that appointment, the shareholders can vote. So effectively, shareholders have a veto. So if they don't get a majority of shareholders voting to approve the appointment effectively, then that director is removed. But shareholders can't. They don't have any power to appoint a director. Any questions, concerns, frustrations arising out of this is necessarily a bit of a refresher, but I want to make the points in the M&A context. So your next question. Oh no, we've got here where somebody who's anonymous is just ahead of Beyonce. Oh, what's happening here? This is the first time I've used this particular. Come on, next question. Okay, something's going wrong here. And let me just bring this to where I can see it. I hurt myself not being able to see the screen. That's why I wanted to sit at that end of the table, but the process wouldn't let me do it. I need. No, that's not it. Come on. This is supposed to be easy. So, no, none of those look helpful. Come on. Right. When in doubt, cheat. Sorry, I just don't want to hurt my neck. A business can enter into a contract, sue and be sued in its own name, true or false? See how we're going. The anticipation. Three, two, one. Sorry, that was clearly too long. There we go, and the crowd goes wild. Okay. That's a little bit problematic, actually, isn't it, really? So what's gone wrong there?
Company.
The definition of a business.
Yeah. So a business is not a corporate entity, right? Sorry, I was just happy that 60 seconds was over. That was why I made it clap. I think I needed to go with... So, yeah, basically a company can sue and be sued. A business is a thing that a company owns, or a person owns, or a unit trust owns, or a partnership, or the partners in a partnership own. So, again, just making sure that you understand the differences. This better work. Oops, sorry. Oh, we'll find out who's winning in a minute, because this should work. No, what's going on here? I think I just went too quickly. This is just hurting. Go back that way. All right, that's what's happening, is I'm being too anxious. Sorry. Who can own a business? A legal person, a partnership, shareholders. How many have I got playing? 11? Is that right? 12? If I sit this way, it'll make a bit more sense. Okay, I'm going to work on the basis. I think we only had 11 last time. Let's just... Oh no, I got everybody in. Good, good, good. Okay, again, happy with it. What's the difference? The shareholders own a company owns a business. Partners, jointly and severally, are in partnership, and partners, jointly and severally, can own a business, but a partnership is nothing, right? It's a formation. It doesn't own anything. The partners own the thing. The partners have liability.
You have company partnerships.
You can have partnerships of companies. So you might have, the partners don't have to be humans. In fact, many accounting firms these days have the poor old auditors, the individuals are partners, and their partners are all of these different companies, because the non-audit partners who don't have to practice that way are separate. But at the end of the day, the business that they operate, or the assets that are owned jointly and severally by the partners, who might be corporations or might be humans. They might be unit trusts, they might be discretionary trusts. In fact, a discretionary trust won't own anything either. The trustee is the legal owner. Okay? So, yeah. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Here we go. So, I'm loving that Lord Dedding is coming out to play. I appreciate that. Okay, doesn't have a name but is moving the fastest. Good to see. This is where I have to stand away from... Which of the following does not have a legal personality? A company, a partnership, a natural person, a trustee. Which does not have... I think I just answered this one a minute ago, so I might be sad. Let's see.
Who is that 12th person all the time?
I'm sure it's a different 12th person every time, and this is why we do it anonymously. And Carly's just about to submit her result. I think they get a bit quicker from here. You get less time. So, we're seeing different answers. So, a partnership definitely doesn't have, so a trustee does, the trustee has a legal personality, a trust does not. So the trustee is the entity, or the trustee might be an entity, so it might be a corporation, it might be a human being who has the capacity to enter into contracts for the trust. The trustee has duties about the way that they will operate or act, but they do not, the trust itself doesn't have a legal personality, the trust does. So if you are suing a trust, which is the kind of language we would hear all the time, you in fact sue the trustee. If you enter into a contract with a trust, again, we use that language all the time, we are entering into a contract with the trustee. If we buy something from a trust, we enter into the contract with the trustee. So, I amuse myself. Only myself there. Okay, the anonymous person is working to speed here. Okay, Proprietary Limit, or PTY Ltd. I've got to be quiet. What does it stand for? This is why I've changed to this kind of quiz, so you can put words in, not just multiple choice. Hopefully it works. 3, 2, 1. Time is up. Correct answer is Proprietary Limited. Okay, so again, there are a couple of different versions of that. Everybody there is pretty much in the right space. That there's a typo there, which is a bit sad. You see private all the time, private, and that's, so let's think about what those words mean for a second though. Proprietary Limited. What does that mean? What's a synonym for proprietary? Yeah, ownership. So if I have a proprietary interest in something, that means I have an ownership interest, right? So the very crux of what a proprietary limited company is goes to limitations on ownership. Can't remember what other quiz questions I've put in there, so I'll stop and we will come back to that in a moment. But often we tend to think about limited in terms of limited liability. In a proprietary limited company, we do have limited liability, but the PTY goes to the ownership question. We've got a factor for speed. All right, next one. I feel like I need to add in music. Don't you think that's the missing factor? How do we know a company is a public company? What will its name include? How do we know it's a public company? Three, 2, 1. This one was a little bit harder. Correct answer is I have limited or LTD or LTD dot. So I suspect that might have been a typo for Proprietary Limited, PTY Ltd. That's a private company. Again, goes to ownership, right? It's private company. It is not available to the public to invest in. So limited, LTD, other options might have included NL. So no liability companies, NL companies, we don't see them very often these days, are by their nature public companies. A public company, all listed companies are public, but not all public companies are listed. It's another good way of thinking about that. You cannot tell from the name of a company whether it is listed or not under Australian law. Okay, you can tell whether it's public. So if somebody is telling you they work for Fred Blogs Pty Ltd that's listed on the stock exchange, you know that they are not telling you the truth, because a proprietary limited company is not a public company and all that, but otherwise. Cool. By the way, I'm only refreshing you on the bits of company law that I'm interested in this subject, which may, of course, not have been a focus in what you were doing at all. Okay, do I have to hit that button again? Yes, I do. Which of the following features does a company not have? It's a legal person in its own right. It has legal personality distinct from its shareholders. It can sue in its own name. It can be sued. It's not liable for debts that exceed its paid-up capital. Slightly tricky, but not unfair. Here we go. So this is right. So on the whole, everybody's in the right space here. If the person who wasn't there wants to ask me about that, that could be a bit of a nervous click as well. So just because shareholders aren't liable doesn't mean that the company itself isn't liable. Okay, so the amount of money, and if we think about this from the point of view of the asset, at one stage, this was my company. I had the robot and no cash, but then I kept doing business and I got more cash. The amount of cash I have might in fact be, hopefully will be, more money than was actually invested. The assets that I have might hopefully do turn into a greater sum than the amount of the original or cumulative investments. But if I borrow against that or I enter into liabilities as a company, the company will still have to continue to pay its debts. Come on, somebody's got to knock this anon person out, and it looks like we've got you. No? Not quite. Be fast to get more points. How many directors does a proprietary limited company have? At least one, at least three. Told you this one along the way. Yay. Don't really want to spend any time on this. Just an opportunity for how many directors must an Australian public company have? At least one, at least three. Again. So public companies do need to have more. Interestingly, a public company only needs to have a minimum of one shareholder. Used to be more than that, but now you can have a single shareholder public company, but you still need to have 3 directors. See, as I said, that's not what you haven't checked that lately.
At least one shareholder.
You have to have at least one shareholder,
And then 3 directors.
but 3 directors. Mr. Taco, climbing. What's the maximum number of ordinary shareholders a proprietary limited company can have? At least 1, at least 3, no more than 50. Need to learn to spell. No more than 1,000. It's actually a badly worded question, that one.
Yeah. Now that I've actually thought about that, it is.
But the opportunity for doing it as a quiz, right, is for an opportunity to have a conversation about these pieces. So,
Because we all went 50, but it's really 20.
no, it's 50, but you can have more than 50. It's 50 non-employee shareholders. So you can also, so there are opportunities to go over and still restrict in professional firms as well. So there are some rules. So, and this is where the complexity comes from, is that there are certain types of professions where the legislature has determined that it is not appropriate for people who conduct a profession to limit their liability, that they should be personally exposed if they make mistakes. Lawyers were among that for a very long time, still are in many ways. Barristers still are. So barristers, in order to practice, to have a certificate as a barrister, you need to practice as a sole practitioner effectively. You cannot incorporate. Law firms can now incorporate. Auditors can practice in partnership, but you still need to have at least one human on the neck, so to speak. The reason I said this was badly worded is because generally the rule is once you get to 50 shareholders, you need to transform and become a public company or get rid of shareholders, but you can have additional shareholders who are employees. So engineering, accounting firms, similar professional firms often work in that kind of exception where the shareholders are also employees, work in that kind of regime. Why do they do that? Because they want to control who owns the shares. If we have a proprietary limited company, then you can only transfer shares if the board approves the transfer. So if I'm an engineering firm and I'm running as a proprietary limited firm, my shareholders are engineers who work in the firm, I don't want my engineer employees selling shares to whoever they like. So, and they could do that if it was a public company, absent a shareholders agreement that restricted them from doing that. So again, so that goes to the proprietary. A private company is a company where the board also controls who the shareholders are. By the way, the answer at least one, I guess it's a badly worded question, but a proprietary limited company needs to have at least one shareholder. You cannot in Australia have a company that doesn't have a shareholder or a director. In some other jurisdictions you can. So, and it could, and there are circumstances where you can see that could happen. Somebody dies. So with a shareholder, that means the estate can be the shareholder, but in Australia a natural person it has to be a director. So the estate remains the shareholder, but a natural person needs to step in and become a director within 14 days, and that would often be the executor of an estate. Okay, this bit goes too fast. I've got to work out, too slow. I've got to work out the, what's the minimum number of shareholders a public company can have? Oh, we've talked about this one. At least one. So a public company can have more than 50 shareholders, but so there's no restriction on the number of shareholders for a public company, but it must have at least one. So, and there are many jurisdictions where you can have less. Now, a public company, I'm talking technically about a public company. A listed company, in order to remain listed, the stock exchange will look at the number of shareholders that a company has and may delist a company that doesn't have enough shareholders. However, and we'll talk about this when we get to the takeovers, that can end up resulting in a significant fraud on remaining shareholders. So we look at that in the context. But so that's listing rules. Remember, the listing rules are the contract that a company has when it lists with the ASX. But from a legal position, in order for a company to exist, it must have at least one shareholder. Now, I'm recognising too, we've got people in this group who have not done company law. So this is part of a way to sneakily throw in some extra company law for you. think it's so nice of Beyonce to drop in on our little quiz. Can a company own shares in itself? Yes, companies can own companies, so of course it can. Yes, but only if an exception to section 259A applies. No, 259A prohibits a company from owning shares in itself. No, companies cannot own companies.
There's a tiny exception to this that are
Well, I don't know. You got a whole 3 more seconds to decide where that fits. So, it's this is when I was preparing this quiz where I realised that this tool didn't do one of the things I thought it did, which was allow for more than one correct answer. So I've kind of fudged as I've gone along. But basically the general position is that, of course, a company can own assets, which includes shares in a company. A company cannot own shares in itself as a general statement unless an exception applies. And there are a range of exceptions. We will look at them in the takeovers provisions, because when we get to takeovers, we need to be able to think about whether or not somebody has a relevant interest. So a company can't own a share in itself directly. We have issues when it owns indirectly. The exceptions include things like, say you borrow money from a bank and you use your share portfolio as security for that, and you own shares in the bank. The bank exercises its security. The bank then can effectively own shares in itself, pending turning those shares into money. So that's the kind of exception that fits in. But as a general rule, a company can't own shares in itself. And it's surprising how often, because it sort of seems a bit, it's like taking self-love to a new extreme, isn't it? But it would be a fraud on shareholders if shareholder funds were used to issue more shares in the company, or to buy shares from some shareholders and not others in order to change the way the company works. You are right that buybacks, that's what buybacks are, but buybacks are ultimately, even we call them buybacks, what we do is we pay investors money in order to cancel their share.
Yeah, it's that momentary.
But there's a moment in time where the share is purchased, but then it's immediately cancelled. So it falls under that exception. We'll ask it close to the end now. We might have a winner any minute. A little bit of an adjustment. Taken this one to an extreme. Shareholders only have to contribute to the debts of a company if they are also directors, to the extent of the amounts called and unpaid on shares they hold, if they are very unlucky, or if the ASX rules say they do. Okay, everybody's in there. Okay, so a little bit of a spread, but basically this is, most of you are on the right track here. So basically, one of the ways when I was setting up our little sort of set of investments in this company is, as we issue shares, I might have issued partly paid shares. And so if my share is only partly paid, so say that you had $100 share, but I only took $20 from you up front, the company then, the board at any time can make a call on the balance. You as an investor only have an obligation to pay money if a call has been made. So if the company goes into liquidation and a call hasn't been made, again, usually an administrator or a liquidator would come in, take over the board and make that call, to be perfectly fair. But if for whatever reason that call is never made, there is no way that, once we've got the curtain there. Now, it's not entirely true to say that shareholders will never, ever have to contribute to the company's debt. If the shareholder is also a director and that director or the board have breached their duties, they may well have personal liability. So, again, this by itself is probably too loose, but on the whole, a lot of what we'll be talking about over the course of the 4 days we're together will be around the circumstances in which directors may have to put their hands into their own pockets.
Do you remember the case of the toll company up in Queensland that their partly paid shares listed on the share market and the partly paid shares tanked the share price? And all these penny investors came in not realising what they were buying.
Yeah, they're just moving on market move. And so there was a lot of automated trading.
And then they got calls on them, and so they bought them at 1 cent and had a call for $10 per share. And so it was cleaning people out. And so they were going and buying the real shares, and there's something. We're calling up that. Can't remember the name was, but
no, I can't remember either. I do remember it had something to do with toll roads, but there are a number of them, a number of circumstances where they had. There was a fairly major share crash in the 1960s where that was a big reason for it too, calls that were happening. It's kind of interesting. Hanging on by a thread there, I think. And the winner is anonymous Carly.
I had to be anonymous because I didn't want to humiliate myself.
But you didn't. Congratulations. Well done, shall I? There we go. Something like that. Oh, now I've hit the button for too long. Questions, concerns, frustrations. So we're looking at I know a number of you haven't done company law, but these are the kinds of things that we had in there is the stuff that we're going to be looking at until we get into the specific things. So thinking about how a company is separate from the individuals who control it and being able to recognise the difference between a company and its assets. And its assets includes the business that it does. So we often conflate human beings with the things that they do. Here's Michael, he's a student. But student is the thing that you're doing. Michael is the person that you are, or the name that is given to the person that you are. So a company doesn't have a physical structure. Another piece of procrastinating viewing that I might recommend is there's a movie with Meryl Streep in it on Netflix at the moment called Laundromat, which is, again, about some of the scams that were followed out of the GFC and the law firm Mossack Fonseca, I think they're called. It's just got out of my head. The Panama Papers is what we talk about it as. But it's got a lot of really neat little short-term explanations of how these things are different. And also this common misconception that a company is a physical thing, like it's an office with a desk and a receptionist and a bank account. A company is not that. A company is a legal construct. There is no law that says that a company has to do anything other than have a shareholder and a director. The shareholding can be whatever that share. You literally can have a $2 company. You can have a 10-cent company, a 1-cent company if you wish. And it might never do anything other than hold that 1 cent that it holds. Okay, let us return. Get lots of confetti there, but no sound. I'm sorry. All right, so the I didn't have any questions in there about promoters. Can we just talk about promoters for a minute? Did you talk about that in company law at all? You would have talked about pre-incorporation contracts and promoters in particular. So what is a promoter in the sense of a company in a pre-incorporation contract? What or who? I haven't stopped for a break. Eat Tim Tams as you go. So a promoter is basically the founder. So that's the language that, or any person who is promoting investments in a company that hasn't yet been formed. So in the sense of a pre-incorporation, people who are intending to form a company, who haven't yet done so, might enter into a contract with the intention that the company will be the party to the contract. So promoters will enter into contracts effectively as agents for a company that doesn't yet exist. So companies can enter into contract in a way, in the reverse way from humans. Well, while there's nothing to stop a miner from entering into a contract, it's pretty hard to enforce contracts against miners unless they fall within the categories of contracts that are enforceable. So necessaries, beneficial contracts of service, that kind of thing. Where a company can actually enter into a contract before it exists, in the sense that a promoter will act as an agent for a pre-incorporation contract, so a contract where the intention is. So why would you do that? Usually it's because you've got a plan, but it's a chicken and egg problem. You can't take the investment, start doing the thing. You can't buy the asset until you have the company. You can't get the investment that is required so that the company has the money that it needs to make the investment until you know that the contract to buy the investment or to get the supply or to employ the person or whatever it is actually going to happen. So the law allows for this by allowing for contracts to be put in place. They might even be conditional on appropriate investment coming in. They might be conditional on the contract being formed, but the intention of the parties from the very beginning is that the contracting party will be, or a contracting party will be, the company.
How would that actually be structured? Are you using the anticipated name of the company to be incorporated?
You can reserve a name. So ASIC allows you to reserve a name. So companies can change their name with 75% of shareholders approving that.
And what does mean on a practical basis on the actual pre-incorporation contract itself? Who are the parties then?
So the party would be, so my robot company, I might have entered into a contract with you to supply you 100 robots a month for the next however long.
Yeah.
You're happy to enter into that contract with my company if you know that I can actually fund the production of 100 robots a month. That's a big jump from 2 a month or whatever I was building before. But as long as I've got funding, so it might be condition precedent on that. So I say, okay, I'm going to form a company and I'm going to get outside investors. So you don't want to enter into a contract with me as an individual. You want to enter into a contract with the company that's got the money. So I would enter it into the company as agent for a company, the name of which is proposed to be Kath's Amazing Robot Company, ABN ACN to be advised.
Yeah.
And one of the terms of that contract would be that you get evidence that the directors have endorsed that contract as soon as possible. I then go out to the market with some kind of disclosure document, most likely. I get my different investors. It might be private equity, it might still be a proprietary limited company, might be a public company. I say to my investors, I need this money to build 100 robots a month. I've already secured a purchaser who's going to purchase them at this price. We're looking at making a profit of X. I've made all of those promises. Again, company wants to do that most likely. So we get that company formed as quickly as we can. Okay, got some slides here. What other things do I want to talk about? Sorry, I just want to look at my list because I'm kind of right. Okay. So we've talked about those things. I'm just going to jump ahead a few slides. So thinking about incorporation, we use these words kind of interchangeably. Incorporation. So incorporation goes to the creation of a company. But companies also need to be registered. So up until 2001, from memory, with this iteration of the Corporations Act, the incorporations power, so we've got some constitutional law here, was actually not reserved to the Commonwealth. So what would happen is that each state had its own registry of companies that were incorporated, and then we had a Corporations Act, or a company law that was a federal law that dealt with a register of companies once they'd been incorporated at the state level. That's historical. You don't really need to worry about that too much at this stage, but it's one of the reasons why we have a number of kind of quirks. So it's actually constitutional law that ends up with some of the quirks in the decisions about what is regulated federally and what is regulated at the state level. So it wasn't actually in the recording, but when we were going through talking about business broker, I don't think it was in the recording earlier, so business brokers are regulated at the state level. So if Michael wants to ply his trade in more than one state, he has to meet the qualification requirements in each of the states he wants to practice in, where a company, once it is actually registered, technically will be incorporated in a state, but it is registered, and it can operate anywhere in Australia and anywhere in the world, really. It has legal personality for that stage.
Business names was the other thing, which
Yeah.
only fixed 5 years ago.
Business names are, again, still technically within the jurisdiction of each of the states, and you used to have to, so business names are often thought of as an intellectual property right, like a trademark. So if you want to trade under a name that is not your own, let's get a business name to protect it. In fact, it's an obligation. If you are going to trade under any name that is not your own name, then you need to register that name as a business name in the state in which you do that. So that meant, my law firm name is Nolan Legal, all one word. I used to trade as Nolan Legal in both New South Wales and Victoria, and I had to have a business name registration in both of those states. About 5 years ago, they brought that back together. Particularly, what's actually driven that is domain names as much as anything else, because people were effectively passing off, holding themselves out to have a name or to trade under a name that was actually associated with a bigger business somewhere else. And as businesses didn't actually, sorry, I got distracted by that. So business names because it's actually an obligation. If a law firm, for example, was not in fact trading in Queensland, it couldn't actually register its business name in Queensland, which meant somebody else could take that business name, potentially register a domain, or potentially hold themselves out as doing something that they weren't. So we've got different kinds of body corporates, or bodies corporate, is the better way of saying it, which can be registered. So that includes a proprietary company, an unlimited company, a public company, companies limited by guarantee, unlimited public companies with share capital, and no liability companies. We don't need to know about the precise differences between all of them. What is important for you to be clear on is that a proprietary limited company or a proprietary company that is limited by shares, our PTY Ltd or proprietary limited company, cannot offer shares to the public, cannot be listed on a stock exchange, that the board can restrict the way that shares move. So if we are buying or selling shares in a proprietary limited company, part of the transaction necessarily involves the board agreeing to those share transfers and almost always a complete change to the board if there's 100% change of ownership. And other types can be listed. We've sort of touched on this idea of a share when we were playing around with the bits of money. A share is literally that. It is your proportional slice of the pie. The pie just can get bigger or smaller. It is not a dollar value. The amount that you pay for a share may or may not reflect the value of its shares. The amount that you pay for a share, if you multiply that by how many shares there are, is your notional market cap for the company, but may or may not represent the actual net present value of that company. And you can think very quickly, if I own 26% of the shares in a company and somebody else owns 74% of the shares in the company, if I were to transfer 2% to them, that 2% individually might have more value than the whole 26%. Why would that be? So that they went from 74 to 76%, because it gives them effective control. Because at 75%, they can pass special resolutions. They can change the name of the company. They can change what the company does. They can definitely pass board resolutions. They can control moves at different types of percentages. So controlling shares can have different values. Am I just confusing you all here? Yes, I am. Come back and ask me questions as we go. One of the concepts I want you to have a look at is what a security is. Because we will talk mostly about ordinary shares, particularly we won't even only talk about ordinary shares, but a lot of the time we are just talking about ordinary shares. But particularly as we're looking at private equity transactions, as we move into them over the course of tomorrow, we will also talk about preference shares and convertible notes, bonds, and other kinds of hybrid instruments. So let's think about this in as practical and as easy way as we can. Most companies, when they start, will just issue ordinary shares. An ordinary share is literally that, a plain old ordinary share. If you have nothing other than ordinary shares on issue, if you have 100 ordinary shares on issue, then every share represents 1% of the voting power, 1% of the right to dividends if they are declared, 1% of the asset distribution on a winding up. But you can issue different kinds of classes of shares. So one of the most famous listed companies that has different classes of shares on issue is News Limited, and the Murdoch family in particular. So there are many classes of shares, but two kinds of classes of shares that you see on issue. There are ordinary financial shares and there are voting shares, which carry very little financial interest attached to them. The Murdoch family control most of the voting shares, which is why even though significant amount of the value, so the rights to dividends, they do not have the majority of the rights to dividends or the rights on a winding up of that company, but they have the rights to vote. Why is that? Partly that's one of the reasons that they're listed on New York rather than Australia, because it was very difficult to have that separation of voting powers until relatively recently here. I think it's New York that they're listed on. It's one of the overseas exchanges anyway, even though they still have, quite charmingly, their AGM in Adelaide every year, which is a nod to patriotism at one level, but also makes it very difficult for the very small number of non-Murdoch family members who hold those voting shares to get to a meeting. One could think of it cynically that way. But effectively, the shareholders have entrusted that family with the management of the business. most shareholders in news, they're just looking for a financial return, which until relatively recently, it's delivered quite spectacularly and regularly. They're saying, we're not interested in managing this company. The institutions are not interested in managing it. They're saying, we'll let effectively that family do it. I'm sure they have members, management team members who aren't family members now, but I can't be sure of that. But effectively, they've separated out the voting. In an early stage investment, we often have different types of shares based on the different types of risks. So when I took some money from my friends, family, fools, but maybe I branched out into some angel investors or other early stage investors now, quite often it's not at all unusual to issue what are called preference shares. So I might have 50%. So let's say we've got 100 shares on issue. I've put in my intellectual property, my business plans, my great idea, and my commitment to work in the business for the next 2 years as we try and make it work. And a group of other investors have together put in $1 million. The way it often works is that investors who put in cash get preference shares, and people who put in time, effort, sweat equity is the language we often use, they get ordinary shares. So what does a preference share give you? A preference share will usually provide for a preference on the winding up of the company. So if you've invested cash and it doesn't work out and the company needs to be wound up, you get paid your money back before people who didn't put cash in get their money back. Preference shares will often convert to ordinary shares in a period of time. Another kind of share that converts that is often used is a convertible note. They get other names as well. They are sometimes called a hybrid security. So a hybrid security is something that is partly debt and partly equity, or could be either. So if instead of issuing preference shares to my investors, I issued convertible notes, effectively I am borrowing money from those investors. And those investors will have a right at a future time to either say, I want my money back, or I would like to convert that to equity. And usually the price will be determined in a particular way. Why is it that the person who holds the note has the right to make the decision? Shouldn't the company have the right to make that decision? Our tax person says no.
They're taking the risk. So
They're taking the risk. Ultimately, anybody could make, it's the terms of the deal. Almost invariably, it is the investor who has that right, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is tax consequences. So it's only because part of what the tax department wants to know is, are you making an income return or are you making a capital return? So if I borrow money from you, I am going to pay you interest on it. The language we often use here is coupon. I'm going to pay a coupon on the note. So if you've lent me $100 and every 6 months I give you $10 back, the tax department is going to say that is a loan. Your investment, effectively your equity, is the $100 that you've put at risk, and the income you receive is the interest, the $20 a year that you're getting in interest. If it's a hybrid instrument though, if you are lending me the money, you can decide whether it's debt or equity. So if I then pay you back, effectively you are getting a return on your money. You might make if it's a loan, you might make a loss, you might make a gain. You have to declare the coupon, the difference. If you convert it to equity at a particular price, then at that point you are receiving a return on your capital, and so it takes it into the capital gains regime. Again, I'm vastly oversimplifying, but in order to structure in a way that the interest you pay pending conversion can be tax deductible for the company, the election needs to be in the hands of the lender. I'm talking about things that aren't on the slides, but so it's important for us to recognise what a security is, because the general prohibition is you can't issue securities without complying with a whole set of laws. So before you even start to take money from strangers, assuming that you've agreed with me that the reason you would do any of these transactions is to fund something, we've got to work out what it is that we're doing, and if it's a security, which means it's coming into our corporate law or our M&A space, or is it potentially some kind of debt? Ultimately, my quick and dirty assessment here is the quick way of understanding what a security is if it looks like it's a security, if it tastes like a security, if it looks like it's giving you an interest in the business as opposed just to exposing you to debt, to the risk of losing the money that you've lent, then it's probably going to be a security. And so then that effectively means that the laws that relate to securities are going to apply. So we talked about Salomon's case a little bit earlier. I just want to remind you of this. So Salomon is the case where a gentleman, he made shoes from a bootmaker. Does that sound familiar? He had his own business. He then incorporated a company. He shared out some of the shares with members of his family, and then he lent that company money, and he took security for that loan. It went belly up a little while later. Other lenders to the company said, this isn't fair. Salomon has just used this newfangled corporation-y thingy in order to get out of paying these debts. Lord Halsbury said, I am simply here dealing with the provisions of the statute, and it seems to me essential to the artificial creation that the law should recognise only that artificial existence, quite apart from the motive or the conduct of the individual corporators. In other words, the law has set up this artificial synthetic thing, the corporate structure. They've set it up so that gentlemen can take risks with other gentlemen's money. And if these gentlemen obey the law, it doesn't matter that one of the reasons that they did that was to limit their liability to the paid up capital. And it doesn't matter that if they loaned money that they took security, as long as there was no fraud on other creditors, that there was no fraud on the shareholders, that it is a perfectly valid way of setting up your affairs to limit your liability. And the fact that you did it on purpose to limit your liability does not make you a bad guy. It's effectively what the statute says.